Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to your morning briefing for Thursday, the 29th of May, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Let's go ahead and jump inside the domestic sit rep. Robert, good morning. I'm going to start off with this arrest quota. There's been a lot of unhappiness, especially here from Stephen Miller, about the relative lack of deportations. So, what's the latest?
Good morning, Mike. So apparently there's been some private discussions in the White House and with executive branch officials, and Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and White House advisor Stephen Miller reportedly told senior Trump immigration officials that they need to ramp up immigration arrests and deportations to 3,000 per day with the goal of more than 1 million arrests per year. And from what I've seen, apparently, Stephen Miller was very angry in these meetings, and a lot of these senior immigration officials apparently are saying that they're afraid they're going to lose their jobs if they don't meet this quota. And yeah, I think this is a direct reaction to the discontent with the level of arrests and deportation so far.
Yeah, sure. So let's break this down. Do you know about how many per day, like maybe just an average or ballpark, that are being deported right now?
I don't know off the top of my head the exact number, but I think they recently said it's like somewhere in the number of like 50,000 since January, somewhere in that neighborhood. It's not 3,000 per day, and I don't think
50,000
even
over
close.
the past over 5 months, 5 plus
Yeah,
months.
I don't
Okay.
think it's nearly close to the 3,000 per day goal that Stephen Miller's
Oh
putting
yeah,
out.
no way. Okay. All right. Given what we know about ICE capacity and in some cases willingness of local, like state and local law enforcement to work with us, is this 3,000 arrests per day? Is it even feasible?
I think it's unrealistic, and that's because exactly what you said. There's a lot of people compare this to the deportation operations under Eisenhower in the 50s, but the main obstacle that the Trump administration is dealing with that Eisenhower wasn't is exactly that, the lack of local and state level cooperation, especially in key states on the border like Arizona. And I think that the lack of actual capacity, even if the Trump administration took every single credentialed law enforcement officer in the federal government and said you're doing deportations now, I don't think they can meet that 3,000 per day. And a lot of that has to do with the sanctuary state, sanctuary city policies where they're not cooperating, which I think is also why the Trump administration has been going harder than they have in his previous term on getting these sanctuary cities and states to drop these policies or stop interfering with ICE operations with through these criminal and civil suits from the Department of Justice.
Mhm. Isn't there? I believe there's also a housing capacity or detention capacity that ICE is butting up against because I know there are some of these the Geo Group, the private prisons and private detention facilities that they've uh, been working with DHS to reopen. Is that is it your understanding that that's also a problem? We just don't have the facilities to store all these people while they await deportation.
I think that's a major factor too, and it was I think we talked about it right after the election. I forget the name of the official. It's a Texas, I think, agriculture department official who volunteered like huge parcels of land to build new detention facilities to mitigate that problem. But I haven't seen any updates on that actually happening. And yeah, that is still another major obstacle to actually implementing this goal of 3,000 deportations per day.
Mm. All right. Aspirational. All right, let's go ahead and move on. And Robert, I'll just let you take it from the permanent spending cuts.
So the Office of Management and Budget said that they are going to ask Congress to enact $9 billion in spending cuts through the rescission process, and this could be as soon as Monday. This is important because a rescission bill only requires a simple majority in the Senate per the Impoundment Act. So if there are senators, some GOP senators who want to pass this, they can do it with a simple majority. And then moving over to the domestic side, according to recent reports from Microsoft and the Dutch government, there's a new Russian state-backed hacking group, and they're calling it Void Blizzard, or in the Dutch government case, Laundry Bear. And they said that they're targeting NATO member critical infrastructure and industry. And they said this group has previously flown under the radar, because they've been using living off the land attack methods and other simple attack methods. And the Department of Justice yesterday filed a lawsuit against the North Carolina State Board of Elections. And they said that the State Board of Elections failed to maintain an accurate voter list and are actually violating the Help America Vote Act of 2022. And they said they're also violating this law because they're using a voter registration form that does not clearly require a driver's license or a social security number. And they have said that North Carolina has also failed to maintain accurate statewide voter lists in violation of this law. And I think the DOJ is going to start going after some other states over these same issues of allowing people to register to vote without proof of citizenship. And this is based on Harmeet Dillon, who is the DOJ lead on this lawsuit. And then finally, the State Department has revoked Chinese student visas. And this is coming from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who said the State Department is going to aggressively revoke visas for Chinese students, including any Chinese nationals with connections to the Chinese Communist Party or studying in critical fields. And they're also revising this policy for all future applicants for student visas.
Mm-hmm. Just to reiterate something that we covered yesterday, John Schindler, former National Security Agency counterintelligence agent, said that if you're serious about stopping Chinese espionage, you have to do stuff like this. You have to stop importing Chinese nationals and putting them in American universities and into our tech industries and so on and so forth. So this is actually, I know a lot of people have bemoaned this. Someone the other day said, by restricting foreigners' access to American universities, we're forgetting what made us wealthy in the first place, or some asinine take like that. So I would just say this is a national security. A, it's a national security crisis, but B, I'm actually somewhat hopeful that this is probably going to cut down on some Chinese espionage here inside the United States. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to our global sit rep. Jared, starting with NATO. So there's a big summit coming up next month, and it looks like the minimum defense spending will be raised to 5%. That's up from 2%. What's going on?
Yes. Like you said, this is coming from Secretary General Rutte. And this has been talked about for quite a bit. There was talk over at the foreign ministers meeting in Turkey earlier this month. And this plan could include 3.5% of GDP on hard military spending. So you're talking like jets, tanks, ships, and 1.5% on infrastructure, cyber, and other things, which we also previously talked about as a suggestion coming out of the foreign ministers meeting. They were talking about, oh, well, we need hardened roads. We need hardened barriers in order to actually get things to the front line and actually maintain their protection. Now, of the 32 members of NATO, only 22 have actually reached the current 2% spending target.
Mm-hmm. That's a very important point. I know the Canadians have been talking about ramping up defense spending. They are sub 2%. I think they're maybe only like 1.5% of defense spending. So it's pretty unrealistic that It's pretty unrealistic that Canada is going to raise their defense spending from 1.5%, which they're struggling to achieve, up to 5%. It seems to me like a number of NATO countries will not meet this. I think Poland is the closest. They're close to 5% in terms of defense spending as a part of GDP. They're like 4.7% or something like that. So ultimately, this is NATO, I guess, at least preparing to deter a Russian conflict. I'll just say one more thing, we'll move on. Russian intelligence, NATO intelligence officials, especially from Estonia, the Baltic countries, they have been warning that Russia's reconstituting and that they will. A year ago, they said Russia would have the ability to invade the Baltics in 5 to 10 years, and then it was like 5 or 6 years, and now some people are saying 2 to 3 years. So this apparently is very real for at least some people in NATO. All right, let's move on here to the European Union. What's up, Jared?
Yes, this is coming from the president of the European Commission there, Ursula von der Leyen, and she called for, quoting, a new form of Pax Europea for the 21st century, one that's shaped and managed by Europe. And this is at an award ceremony that she was at this morning. She was receiving an award. Von der Leyen also cited the reason for this as complacency in NATO. too much dependence on the peace dividend, which we've talked about ad nauseum from the 90s to about the mid 2010s, and general international disorder as a result of the Ukraine-Russia war. Now, I am going to keep a closer eye on this. I think this would take years to truly implement, if not decades. But I'm not sure if this is just increasing European self-reliance, a la NATO 5%, or if this might be an attempt to become a pole of power in the coming multipolar world.
Okay, so EU's calling for a new global order. Is this in conjunction with the United States? Is this a new Western order, or is Europe actually talking about competing against the United States and China for control of the global order?
Just based on Ursula von der Leyen's quote, it sounds like they will be independent of the United States and China, competing with both. I don't think they've got the capacity for that at the moment. Like I said, it would take years, decades to even start to do that. That said, it could be that, start riding the nationalist wave, say you're going to do that, and really all you actually achieve is being more self-reliant so that the U.S., your main security guarantee, can take care of its most pressing security threat. Just basically play into the rhetoric, but don't actually intend to achieve true independence. We've seen some of that out of like France, where France will absolutely talk themselves up. But at the end of the day, when you see how Emmanuel Macron goes and handles like the Ukrainian issues, he tags along with the Americans.
Sure seems to be the case. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. And let's move on to the State Department. They are implementing visa restrictions. So if I understand this right, if you are a member of a foreign government that curbs free speech restrictions on an American, you could have your visa revoked, or you could have some form of restrictions placed on your ability to travel to the United States. Is that correct?
Yes, it's anybody who attempts to curb them in any way, especially if you've implemented a law and you issued an arrest warrant for an American citizen, and that American citizen basically posted on the internet from America, they will revoke your visa. You will not be allowed to travel to the United States. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to look at this and say, oh yeah, European hate speech laws. That's what this is going after. But I don't think that's the case. I think what this is really doing is allowing a mass expulsion of Chinese officials. I don't think we're going to see that right away, but it opens the door for basically, if you try to enforce your laws here, we're kicking you out. Because we've seen the secret police stations pop up time and time again to start trying to enforce Chinese law on the Chinese diaspora. This would prevent that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Interesting. And then let's finish up here with the International Security Forum. The Chinese defense minister is skipping that meeting. Why is that?
The Shangri-La dialogue's happening this weekend. As far as why, the defense ministry for China didn't actually say why. They just said, he's not going. We're sending a delegation from the university in his stead. End of discussion. Now, at the Shangri-La dialogue, it's basically the custom for an informal meeting between the United States Secretary of Defense and the Chinese Minister of Defense to have a sideline meeting. That's obviously not going to happen now. I will be keeping a much closer eye on this to see where does Dong Jun, the defense minister, show up, because I don't know, without the elaboration, we don't know if this is just snubbing the security conference in America or if Dong Jun was removed, which we saw it was, how many times did they replace the defense minister over the past couple of years?
Yes.
They just suddenly disappear out of a place that they were supposed to be at. And, oh, hey, 6 months later, we're charging them with corruption. It's not out of the realm possibility. And the closer we get to 2027, the more they replace these top officials, the less likely I think it is that they'll actually be able to move. I don't think they will hit their wicket.
All right. Thanks for that update, Jared. We're going to go ahead and move on to today's warning items. By the way, just as a reminder for the early warning folks here, if you're an early warning member, if you ever pictured yourself leading your family or neighborhood through a worst case scenario, through a local crisis, a local natural disaster, or man-made disaster, special projects may be for you. There's a link in this morning's report if you have not registered yet for this session. It's coming up tonight at 7 p.m. Central Time. Take about 45 minutes. We'll do some Q&A. And I'll tell you about the number one strategic shift that I'm concerned about. And then we'll talk about some things that you can do at the local level to help prepare yourself for. Really, this is about the end of the existing dollar system and how to prepare for the future dollar system. The dollar's not going away. It's just going to look much different from what we've all grown up with. Again, coming up tonight at 7 p.m. All right, on this topic, I hate to go to the well on this repeatedly. Yesterday, I talked about Senator Ron Johnson, Republican from Wisconsin, talking about a very similar topic. He was on the All In podcast, which is like a tech bro and Silicon Valley podcast, saying very similar things, but he did tell Tucker Carlson in a recent interview something slightly different, which is important. He said the United States is likely to have a fiscal crisis, such as a failed bond auction, before arriving at $65 to $67 trillion in national debt. And there's a very specific reason why he has come up with that number. And he broke down the math on Tucker Carlson. It's worth the watch. He talks about, not only does he talk about our ongoing fiscal crisis, but he also talks about his investigations into the truth of 9/11. And some people really dislike that he is asking some specific questions, which really makes you wonder. At any rate, on Tucker Carlson, Johnson did the math. He said the United States currently has about $37 trillion worth of debt right now. We're like, I think any day now we're going to surpass it if we haven't already. And he said the big, beautiful bill that was passed in the House will add another $22 trillion in debt over the next 10 years. And so that takes us up to about $59 trillion in debt. And then he said every 1% increase to the interest rate is another $4 trillion in finance costs, which we can't afford. So that money will be printed and added to the debt. And he said current borrowing costs for the federal government are about 3.3%, but the 50-year average is above 5%. So we're looking at a potentially 2% increase in interest rates. And I think those are his expectations for talking about yields, basically. Borrowing costs for the federal government. So an additional 2% increase in borrowing costs will produce an additional $8 trillion in debt. That would take the total U.S. debt to $67 trillion in roughly 10 years. And he said, quote, I don't think we'd ever hit that. Something's going to happen. We'll have a debt crisis, a failure in our bond auctions, spiking interest rates even more. And so just looking at this here, if this big, beautiful bill passes the Senate without any major changes, and there are a handful of Republican senators who oppose this for this exact reason. But if the Senate does end up clearing this bill with no major changes, and if Johnson is correct, his prediction is we're not going to make it to $67 trillion, then that means that we will have an acute debt crisis within 10 years. And so it apparently is getting closer, according to Senator Johnson. He characterized the United States as already being in a chronic debt crisis that has not yet become acute. So this is one of those time horizons. Put it on your calendar. It's possible that we have an acute debt crisis well within 10 years. It could be much sooner. But just in terms of our expectations now, I think that is not an unrealistic scenario. And so the Fed's going to be forced to print dollars to buy the debt, essentially as a buyer of last resort. And there's been a lot of talk about changing the reserve ratios. There's a thing called a supplementary leverage ratio, and they're going to basically try to push the primary dealer banks into buying more treasuries. Because the problem is if foreign buyers stop buying or greatly reduce, and they have been already, but if they greatly reduce their buying of U.S. treasuries, someone has to step in. And so that's going to be American banks not necessarily being forced to, but being highly encouraged to buy more treasuries. And at this point, we're just loaning ourselves more money, printing more money to pay the debt. And it's going to end up in a vicious cycle. If you have time, there's a bunch of YouTube videos on this thing called a Minsky moment. And Minsky was an economist, and basically he says, you get this, eventually this cycle will end in a sharp collapse of asset prices. And one of the things he said was stability leads to instability. When you have relative stability over a long period of time, people take more risk and you get more leverage built up in a system. And eventually that leverage gets deleveraged very quickly. And so a lot of people are saying maybe we're headed for a Minsky moment. It sure seems that we could be headed for that just because there's so much leverage built up into the system. It's an interesting argument. At any rate, point is, Johnson says this is happening within 10 years. We'll probably start to prepare for that or think about preparing for that however you can. All right, let's move on here to the next item. And by the way, let me just say this too. Yeah, Ben says we'll have to inflate our way out. Yeah, something that I covered on yesterday's show, it just bears repeating. This is not, we're not going to be able to cut budgets enough to pay for $37 trillion in national debt, an additional $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And so you can't cut your way out of that. You're not going to tax your way out of that, although that's going to be part of it. But also we're going to have to print our way out of it. So your standard of living is going to be greatly reduced. We're talking about higher inflation, higher borrowing costs. If you can't afford a house now, I got some bad news for you. And so I'm optimistic that things will get better eventually. Unfortunately, they're going to get much worse in the interim. All right, moving on. Speaking about getting much worse in the interim, we can go back several years ago, and I remember Bernie Sanders predicting that AI was going to wipe out about 20 to 30% of all American jobs. And, at the time I said, that sounds realistic. And occasionally we see these predictions that sound very extreme. I'm not actually sure this is so extreme. And this is the Anthropic CEO, which Anthropic is one of the AI companies, major AI companies. His name is Dario Amodei. And he warned that artificial intelligence platforms could lead to 10 to 20% unemployment within the next 5 years. He actually said it could happen much sooner. He also said that most of this unemployment is going to be due to a reduction. He says in a reduction in entry-level white-collar jobs. He says half of all entry-level white-collar jobs could be wiped out. And so there's a couple of ways that there's a couple of things that concern me here. Number one is UBI, because in this interview with Axios, I've got a link. You can Google it, but I've also got a link in this morning's report. He proposed a solution to the unemployment problem. He said, look, you just add a 3% surcharge on AI-generated revenue. And he said that would be, quote, redistributed in some way. So that would be given to the government for redistribution. This is essentially universal basic income. This is something that the socialists have been pushing for a long time. It's widely been floated for several years now. It's being floated now by some of these AI guys as a solution in the event of mass job loss, if this actually does happen. So if Amodei is correct here, then higher unemployment and UBI, seems to me, will be the number one issue facing the next presidential election. And if that's the case, then the next election may just break down. I mean, talking about running AOC as a Democratic candidate for president. I'm not sure she'll win, but win a Democratic primary, but she might. And if that's the case, we're only 1 or 2 election cycles away from having a legitimate national referendum, a real presidential election that falls down between socialism and capitalism. And I go back to 2016, Ray Dalio, who's a former hedge fund manager of Bridgewater Associates, started talking about civil war, and my ears perked up. And he said, this is going to be a domestic conflict between socialists and capitalists. And so realistically, in the next 1 or 2 election cycles, it's possible that we could be facing something like this, brought on by high unemployment. Because remember, high youth unemployment is a universal early warning indicator of civil unrest and potentially state breakdown. And you know what I'll do? I'll go back. Basically, this is going to exacerbate our problem of elites and counter elites. Remember, what causes state breakdown, what causes periods of revolution, is a couple of things. And we can go back to the English Civil War and look at this for a really great example. You get an overproduction of elites. There are too many elites and not enough elite positions. If AI is taking these good jobs and taking away some of these elite positions, then we're going to have more people who are aspirationally elite but unable to join the ranks of the elite. And that's typically what happens right before you get a fracturing of the elite class into the elites and counter elites. And that's what actually fuels revolution. You can go back and read a bunch of the work of this guy named Jack Goldstone, and Peter Turchin also. They have pioneered this theory and gone back in history and shown this is what happens. You have too many elites vying for not enough elite positions. You get a fracturing of the elites, and they go to war with each other. And so this is something realistically that could be a major driver of a domestic conflict. High unemployment is how we got this, is one of the reasons why we got the summer of love in 2020. So if we do have high youth unemployment, the chances that we go through some domestic crisis is extremely high. Last point here, Amadei said that most of these lawmakers, he says, quote, they're unaware that this is about to happen. And he said that authorities, including the government and AI companies, he said they should stop, quote, sugarcoating the impact here. There's been a lot of talk about maybe this creates more jobs in the long run than it produces. And people have said, well, they said the same thing about cars, and it's going to put people out of work, and computers are going to put people out of work. And all it's done is just created more jobs. I'm not so sure that AI is actually going to lead to job creation. In the near term, it's going to lead to very rapid job destruction. And I'm sure there will be some job creation, but I don't think I think job destruction is going to outpace job creation. And so we are going to go through a period of many years, maybe several years at least, before job creation catches up to job destruction. And so in terms of being prepared, I would just say, if this is true, and then we can go back and look at what Senator Ron Johnson is saying, the rest of this decade is going to be far more difficult than the first half of this decade, which has been pretty rough, to be frank. All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next item. All right, Robert, the big news over last night is this Court of International Trade ruled that Trump tariffs are unconstitutional, and there's a lot of implications here. Go ahead.
Yeah, they said that Trump wrongly invoked the emergency powers that he did. It's the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to levy these tariffs on foreign trade partners, and they actually gave them 10 days to roll them back. Now, the Trump administration has said that they're going to immediately appeal this, and they're going to ask the appeals court to pause the order, especially the 10-day deadline to roll back all these tariffs, which I think is important because some of these legal experts I've seen chime in on this say that the order sort of implies that Trump is going to have to refund all of this revenue that, as you can see on this chart, has spiked in the last 2 months to over $20 billion projected for this month. And I think this has implications for Trump policies and for this potential upcoming debt ceiling fight, because I think while this is going on, foreign trade partners that are in the middle of this 90-day deadline to negotiate trade deals with the Trump administration, I think are going to start delaying those negotiations to see how this plays out. And I have also seen Goldman Sachs analysts say that they expect Trump to find other avenues to try to levy these tariffs, but those options are limited, much more limited in scope than these emergency powers, and they're going to take longer to implement, because a lot of them require months-long investigations by the Commerce Department. They also said that they don't expect this to impact the budget reconciliation bill that you were talking about earlier. But I think that while this tariff revenue has not been explicitly and directly tied to these tax cuts and trying to fund these tax cuts, I do think that opponents of this bill, especially Senate GOP opponents, could use this ruling as leverage to hold up that bill and try to get steeper cuts in, which I think risk the debt ceiling fight with the Democrats in the coming months. Because, as we've pointed out multiple times, Democrats have been saying they're willing to engage in these extraordinary tactics to try to undermine the Trump administration and hold up their legislative and executive agenda. And I think Democrats are willing to risk a debt ceiling breach, which has very possibly dire second-order effects. As we've already seen, Moody's just recently downgraded U.S. sovereign credit rating. And I think that more of those types of economic impacts, negative economic and fiscal impacts, could happen in this coming debt ceiling fight.
At a strategic level, here's what concerns me. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and President Trump and other administration officials have repeatedly said tariffs are a part of this economic transition back to mercantilism, which is the use of economic power to build your national power. And the fundamental problem here, and this goes back to the end of the dollar system as we know it, however the next dollar system is created, it will be much different than what we know now. Fundamentally, the United States has to bring back at least critical manufacturing back to our country, if not maybe the broader Western hemisphere. We've got to get it closer to home. We've got to produce the things that we need. This is something that Michael Every pointed out, and I'm going somewhere with this. This is something that Michael Every pointed out in my interview with him earlier this month. He said that one of the fundamental problems facing the United States is we have specialized in financial services. We are very good at making money off of money. And the problem is our adversaries like China have specialized in production. And that leaves us without the ability to produce the things that we need in the quantity that we need them to resist Chinese economic dominance and maybe potential military dominance. We don't make enough of the stuff that we need. And that is a consequence of the dollar system because we have to export dollars. We have to be net buyers of goods because we've got to get dollars out into the global system so that these foreign countries have enough dollars to buy what they need, which are priced in dollars. And so fundamentally here, Scott Bessent said the United States has to consume less and produce more. And if we do not have these tariffs that encourage repatriation of critical manufacturing back to the United States, then that is one less point of leverage that the Trump administration has to get the United States to produce more. So, Robert, I just see this as a huge, huge problem for the Trump administration and the strategy of bringing back critical manufacturing to the United States. These countries do not seem to want to do this out of patriotic fervor. I don't think they want to do this. I think they would rather make more money than do this. But this is pretty critical to the Trump pivot here, that this happens. So is this going to the Supreme Court? I mean, I've just seen from law scholars, they say, yeah, this is pretty clear cut. This is an issue for Congress to solve, not something that can be declared by the Trump administration. Is that your reading on it?
Yeah, that's what I've seen. I've also, from what my understanding of the ruling is that it very explicitly undermines that economic statecraft strategy. If I remember correctly, the ruling said that using tariffs as leverage is explicitly not authorized by the law, and that completely just cuts the knees out from under this entire attempt by the Trump administration to do just that, to start bringing production back to the United States. Because if they explicitly are not, if leverage for negotiating tariffs with the idea of reindustrialization is explicitly against the law as it exists, then the Trump administration, I think, has no choice other than to just keep escalating this legal fight to the Supreme Court, which is where I think it is heading.
This is one of the things, just last point here, we'll move on. This is one of the things I'll be talking about tonight is this big seismic shift. If you can go back to this thing called the Triffin dilemma, and Triffin was an economist who back in the 1950s and 60s was warning that the dollar system will eventually fail. And again, the problem is the United States has to be a net buyer of stuff. We have to run trade deficits in order to push dollars out to the global financial system to provide liquidity for these countries who need dollars to buy things that are priced in dollars. If we don't do that, then there's a global liquidity shortage and you get a failure of the global financial system. So Triffin says this thing basically is going to happen in two ways. It will end. The dollar system will end. And one way it ends in currency collapse because we erode production and we run up our deficits so high that it adds to the national debt, and then foreign countries stop buying treasuries. And then eventually there's a loss of faith in a currency and you get currency collapse. And he warned Congress in 1960. He said exactly this was going to happen. So that's one thing. This ends in a currency collapse. The other thing is he said what he proposed is an international world reserve currency. And this is something that Alan Keynes John Maynard Keynes was pushing back around the same time during Bretton Woods. He said he wanted to introduce this thing called the Bancor, and that was an international reserve currency run by the IMF, and the IMF has these things called SDRs, or special drawing rights. And so, just looking at our future, last point, we'll move on. Looking at our future, we either have a currency collapse, the U.S. dollar system retreats. We're no longer the world reserve currency as we've known it, no longer the standard for trade. Maybe we're only the standard for trade in the Western Hemisphere. There will be a competitor, and it could be a gold-backed Chinese currency for external trade, like the digital yuan. Or we get a currency collapse. I mean, those are like the, or we get this international world reserve currency. It seems to me like those are the only three strategic scenarios we're looking at. You ask how this ends. That's the three scenarios. It's probably how this ends. Robert, thanks for bearing with me on this. This is just extremely important to understand that if the Trump administration cannot use these tariffs to force critical manufacturing back to the United States, the logical conclusion is this whole dollar system will eventually end in a currency collapse. And this Triffin dilemma makes this argument very clear, and I think it's very convincing. All right, Robert, thanks for standing by. Let's go ahead and move on to the next item here. Jared, speaking of tariffs, there's been somewhat of a global revolt against Chinese dumping across the world. This is probably best seen in steel production. So what's going on?
Yes, this is all coming from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. They released their 2025 steel outlook, and biggest takeaways I got last year, countries started 81 different anti-dumping investigations, with over a third of them being into Chinese steel and China's pass-through nations like Vietnam. Now, over the last 4 years, China's steel exports have grown 120%. And China has produced about 1 billion tons of steel each year since 2019. At the same time, they are actually reducing their demand a little bit. Now, most of these investigations that these countries have started actually resulted in tariffs, anti-dumping duties, other protective measures, all to prevent themselves from being the dumping grounds. And this includes nations like Peru and Brazil, which we've covered as moving heavily towards China. Now, the OECD expects global excess steel capacity to continue increasing, and which you can see in the graph here. And more protective trade measures are going to be implemented in response to that continued excess steel. So I think this has a lot of implications. You were just talking about, Treasury Secretary Bessent and the Trump administration trying to move everything back. What does this mean for the United States? Well, Bessent can press on this. He can look at Peru, Brazil, Turkey, and go, hey, you guys don't want to be dumping grounds? Fine. Come to the table with us. Let's work something out. So you can build yours. You can build your industrial capacity. We can build ours. Now, as it stands, most of these nations are already semi-voluntarily doing this against China anyway, because they don't want to be dumping grounds. Now, I think if China continues to subsidize and then dump steel, this is going to keep steel largely unprofitable for most companies. It won't make sense. The price of steel is too low. That would prevent other nations from increasing their steel production capacity, achieving all of the NATO 5% spending that we just talked about, building new ships. Aircraft are largely titanium, but any steel components in there, all of that goes away. But it appears that globally, trade is structured to actually be anti-China and prevent them from continuing to undercut everybody else's production capacity. I think that's actually a very good thing for Bessent's mission, and thus the American industrial capacity.
By the way, there's a quick question here. Do you know the quality of the steel produced by China? No, I don't. But a good friend of mine runs a metal fabrication company here locally, and we have been talking about his impacts to steel. He's in the metal business. If he's directly impacted by the tariffs, and he actually said they used to buy a lot of their steel from Mexico. He said most of their stuff's coming from American steel foundries now. So I guess that's probably good news if you work in the American steel sector. Jared, do you know anything about the quality of Chinese steel?
I've seen both ends of it. Some people saying, "Hey, this stuff is garbage." You see the guy's just bending rebar with no effort. But I had a buddy that was out in metal fabrication in California for aeronautics, and he said that all of the stuff they would get, even marked from China, was phenomenal. Just some of the best steel you could get. So I think it largely depends on, does China want to risk losing that particular industry? Like construction, anybody can do construction. Aeronautics, that's a pretty niche one.
Mm-hmm. You know, just looking at this, if you're Peru or Brazil or maybe some of the other countries that are imposing tariffs or some kind of trade barriers on Chinese ability to dump steel into your country, why? I guess I don't exactly understand why these countries continue to cozy up to China, because this is economic warfare. This is Chinese economic warfare against these countries. This is China trying to bankrupt foreign industries by dumping their products, eroding the competitiveness, and selling Chinese products at a price that your domestic industry just can't compete with, and your domestic industry goes out of business. Remember that a Chinese investment firm bought British steel, and they tried to close down the very last steel foundry in the UK. And that forced the British to nationalize British steel and run it. And that is it's not just a military imperative, that's a national security concern. The UK has to be able to produce the steel they need to create military weaponry and military equipment. And it seems like a lot of countries that are remilitarizing or trying to build up their military are going to run into this problem. At any rate, my point being, this is Chinese economic warfare. And this is economic dislocation. This is a huge national security concern against your country. Why would you continue to cozy up to the Chinese? I don't entirely understand it. Maybe my IQ is low. All right, Jared, final point here.
I was just going to say, I think that might come out of the peace dividend that Ursula von der Leyen was citing. Is everybody kind of assumed, hey, we're in an era of global trade. Nobody's really going to war. This is great. We don't need this stuff. I mean, that was why Panama got rid of its military. Is, oh, we don't need it. Like, the Americans are here. We're fine. And I think a lot of people are coming. A lot of different nations are coming to the realization, oh, we do need this stuff. And that's why you're seeing even Peru going, no, China, wait, you cannot do this to us. We want you to sell through our port, but you can't do this to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I guess everything comes down to money. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. We do have some questions for today. There's actually a couple I want to get into. Where can we find a copy of that defense intelligence report mentioned in yesterday's show? That's over on the Early Warning Network, and that's linked. Jared posted it somewhere. So check it out over there. It's available. You can also just Google it. It's everywhere online. All right, Jared, will that also include religious law, i.e. Sharia law? I'm not sure what this is in regard to.
This is that speech and visa issue from the State Department. Presumably, yes, the State Department was very broad and very succinct in what they put out. It was one paragraph saying, we are doing this. If you restrict our speech, we're restricting you.
I can't imagine that this is going to happen to the Gulf Coast countries, but we'll see. All right, can an overabundance of single men also be a catalyst for domestic conflict? It could. I wouldn't say it's necessarily single men. I think it's just youth in general. High youth unemployment is a universal early warning indicator of civil strife. The United States is not an exclusion to that. Next question. How do you see AI tools helping folks like us sifting and prioritizing news and information so as to avoid being swamped and overwhelmed by the ever-increasing amount of information out there? Well, I'm glad you asked, Frozen Nomad. I didn't plan on announcing this, but I hired he is new, but I hired a CPTO, Chief Product and Technical Officer, Technology Officer. He has been building us a new system. We're going to move off our current early warning platform onto something that is custom built for us, and something that's going to allow us to grow and also implement AI. So this is obviously a big problem. There is tons of information out there, and to get as clear a picture as you can, you need more quality information. And so this is something that this year, this AI system will allow us to do, and also this new membership platform that we're going to roll out. It's going to be this year, maybe as soon as like in the next month or two. We'll start moving people over. Lots more to come on that. But in terms of AI being able to prioritize news, I use ChatGPT every day. And what I do is I type out something, I type out an analyst comment, or I type out a section of a report, I copy and paste it into GPT, and I say, what's your response to this? Or what are the gaps in here? Or show me where I am wrong. And so it is, what I have found is it is incapable of replacing human analysis, at least right now. That may change in 2 years, but at least for now, it cannot produce the same quality of analysis that a human can. And we know this for a couple of reasons. It's not just my personal direct experience with ChatGPT and Grok and the others. I downloaded an app that had it's a global news / it's not really it's called like an intelligence platform. It's not really, but you read through the analysis and it's very clear that they just copy and paste an article and put it into ChatGPT and they say, analyze this. And they copy and paste the output from ChatGPT, like the icons and emojis and all, and put it onto their platform. And I was reading through that and I just said, this has no value added benefit whatsoever. So at any rate, point being, AI is going to be really great at sifting and looking through lots of information very rapidly and helping us filter higher quality information to the top of our list. It will not replace a human. It will not replace a human analyst. It's really an analyst's best friend. It is not an intelligence analyst. At any rate, lots more to come on this and how it's going to impact our business operations, and ultimately it's going to allow us to build a better product faster for our members. And we'll have a lot more announcements on that. All right. Frozen Nomad, thank you. Next question. Who initiated this lawsuit? Robert, I think a group of states initiated this lawsuit, correct? The lawsuit against the trade tariffs.
Well, this is actually the result of two lawsuits that were combined. One was Democratic AGs in these states, and the other was actually a conservative legal group representing a bunch of business lobbyist groups. So this is actually two lawsuits. And the conservative one, apparently the lobbies they represent, their argument was that this is interfering with domestic small businesses.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And then just extremely briefly, Robert, this is headed to the Supreme Court, this appeal eventually.
I think so. I think that's the Trump administration is going to continue to appeal, even if they can't get a pause on the 10-day order. Okay.
And then did you say this is an international court? So this is the Court of International Trade, but this is a federal court. These are a panel of 3 judges appointed by Obama, Trump, and Reagan or something like that?
Yeah, this is the U.S. International Trade Court that's based in New York.
Mm-hmm. All right. Great question, Peter. Let's move on. Next question. How would you quantify the degree to which government-funded non-work alternatives are driving youth unemployment or general unemployment? One of the things that this All In podcast said, I don't even know his name, but he's one of the hosts of the All In podcast. He estimated that 50% of all U.S. employment is either directly tied, they're either directly employed by local, state, or federal government, or they are indirectly tied through government contracts, or there's some contractor or subcontractor. He said 50% of, and this is just an estimate. I don't even know if this is true. Obviously, it is at least plausible. 50% of all U.S. employment is directly tied to federal spending or government spending at some level. And so one of the things that was a huge concern to me is when Doge and Elon Musk, and I've supported them 100%, but when they went into the federal government, I said, if they are able to trim, by the way, before even Trump took over, when they were talking about this Doge stuff, I don't think any of us here, early warning, expected Doge to actually be able to cut. First it was $2 trillion, and then it was $1 trillion, and then it's like $150 billion or something like that. But my question was, if they are able to cut $1 trillion, given what we know of how the U.S. economy is tied to government spending, they're basically for a period of time going to be cutting economic activity. So in terms of how much government funded non-work alternatives are driving youth unemployment, it was like 40. Now, this is not directly tied to employment, but if I recall the statistics correctly, 40% of Medicaid expansion recipients were aged 19 to 34 and no disabilities, able-bodied, able to work. 40% of Medicare expansion recipients were between ages 19 and 34 and able to work. That's prime workforce. They are not working, and they are also getting government health care benefits. So I don't know. That's my best knowledge on that matter, Ben. Hope it helps. Dollars are not only traded back to the U.S., but as a reserve currency is required to trade between foreign countries. Doesn't this provide a little shock absorption for a global wash in dollars? Well, we're talking about a dollar glut, and this is something that the Triffin dilemma covers. One of the problems, and we look at China specifically. You look at foreign ownership of U.S. assets in real estate, in equities and bonds and whatever. Basically, we buy things from these foreign countries. We enrich people who produce those things in these foreign countries, and they turn around and they spend those U.S. dollars to buy U.S. assets. So we have effectively financed Chinese purchase of U.S. real estate, U.S. equities, U.S. farmland, U.S. anything they want to buy, as long as they can afford it. Seems to me like a pretty huge national security concern. So in terms of being a shock absorber because there's so many dollars out there, I guess it would maybe depend on the scenario. I'm not sure how to answer that question, I guess, in that case. Next question. Regarding steel, the Nippon is expected to buy American steel. Yeah, Robert or Jared, I know that Trump was trying to mediate that deal. Are the Japanese still buying U.S. steel?
From what I've seen, the Japanese are interested, but the Trump administration's not, which it's on national security grounds. They're saying, no, not going to happen. But we may see investment from the Japanese into it.
Yeah, that's what I've seen, is that they're talking about buying a certain amount of shares in it as an investment, and then having basically allowing it to add, I think, like 70,000 jobs, they're saying, at the steel plant, the U.S. steel plants.
All right. Next question.
As a follow-on to Ben's on government-funded non-work.
Yeah, how many of them are on Medicaid or disability due to damage from the jabs? Robert or Jared, I don't know. You're talking about vaccine injuries. I don't know.
I don't know that specific as far as the vaccine stuff, but I will point out there's been, I think for a couple months now, there's been this interesting stat going around online, and that is Medicaid pays for in-home care, right? But not like for nurses, but if you are, living with your parents and your parents are on Medicare or Medicaid, you can get a stipend basically to take care of them. And I think in New York, that has jumped from in like the early 2000s to like 20,000 people in the city of New York that were receiving that stipend to like 250,000. So there's a lot of that expansion of that kind of stuff. I don't know how tied that would be, or any of that growth would be tied to vaccine injuries, though.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, I saw that too, Robert. There's just an incredibly large portion of the U.S. economy that is directly tied or indirectly tied to federal spending. And let's go back to the Triffin dilemma. When you have an economy that makes money for money, it doesn't produce what it needs to produce, and also is running twin deficits, the fiscal deficit and the trade deficit, and is running up $37 trillion, maybe up to $67 trillion in national debt, plus $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. How much longer can you do that? Can you sustain that before people start to lose faith in the dollar and they start choosing something else? And right now there is no something else. There's nothing that will replace, quote unquote, replace the dollar system. But this country has to get back to producing something. Otherwise, we will suffer the logical conclusion of the Triffin dilemma, which is currency collapse. And Let me just say one other thing about this. There's a few more questions we'll get to. My big problem with, listen, I'll talk more about that tonight. Someone asked what's coming up tonight. Tonight, 7 p.m., if you're an early warning member, I sent you a link. We're going to be talking about the seismic shift. I'll be talking about a little bit more about the Triffin dilemma, and which is not new. I mean, it's 70 plus years old at this point. But we'll talk about the dollar system, what I think is going to happen. We'll look at a couple different scenarios and then also discuss what you can do about it. All right. Don says, excited to be part of early warning. Well, thank you, Don. We appreciate that. We're glad you're here. Mike, do you prefer ChatGPT over Grok? Listen, I use ChatGPT just because I run it on my desktop. I use ChatGPT most often, but I use Grok when I'm on X. The other cool thing about GPT is you can create your own. And so I've got one where I've uploaded a bunch of documents and it helps me work my way through complex issues and really understand better. So I also use ChatGPT because I can upload documents there. So if there's like a really long congressional hearing transcript that we have, I'll just throw it into ChatGPT, and it saves me a lot of time. What it does not do is it can't produce the analysis that we can, but it can help you make connections that maybe you otherwise wouldn't have. Any other questions here, Jared?
Nope, all caught up.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, listen, if you want the link, it's in this morning's report. So you can get the link through the app, or you can get the link on the report in your email. Everyone with that. By the way, if you would like, we will be moving platforms in probably the next 1 to 2 months. It is coming. Actually, we are probably going to start beta testing here in like the next week or so. So I have not been pushing this very hard. But if you want to join early warning as it exists today, start a free 7-day trial over at www.earlywarningnetwork.com. We will be moving to this new platform. This is something you're going to want to be a part of. There's a lot of questions about how AI can improve what we do. I don't think we're at great risk of being replaced by AI, at least not in the foreseeable future. We have extreme upside potential through AI, and that's what we've been working on, and we'll continue to work on. And so I'm extremely excited about what this looks like in another 30 to 60 days from now. So we'll start sending out invitations for beta testers and get all this stuff done up, and then we'll get everyone moved over, and we will be firing on all cylinders. So with that, everyone, thanks so much for the support. Thanks for watching. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.